This is going to be the final lesson that we're going to do before we start to talk about the French Revolution itself. And we're going to focus on the general political, social, and economic state of France at the calling of the Estates General. So, the last lesson we went through a sort of descriptive process of every single thing that took place leading up to the eventual reluctant calling of the Estates General by Louis XVI. And so, what was France actually like at this point? Because it's important that we have a sort of understanding of the kind of social, political, and mainly economic position of France at this point, because the Estates General, the calling of the Estates General, eventually devolves into the revolution, and it devolves into the attempts at trying to establish a constitutional monarchy, and then the eventual reign of terror that ends with the image that we can see on this screen here, with the execution of numerous individuals, including the monarch himself. So this lesson is going to explore what I've described here as the kind of macro level issues that were taking place in France at the point of the meeting of the Estates General in May 1789. So we're talking about the general issues that were going on across the French state rather than the more micro, more minute issues that were going on in individual day-to-day life. So it's, like I said, useful to provide a detailed overview of what I've described here as the dire political and economic situation that existed at the point of the calling of the Estates General, and how this can eventually lead to the scenes that we see, and the issue that we see with the French Revolution itself. So what was the political state of France by 1789? Well, you probably have some indication of what this was like already from the last few lessons when we've looked at the sort of overall process of how the Estates General eventually was called. The failing of the Paris Parlement, the failing of the Assembly of Nobles, and the establishment of the Estates General. So we knew already that Louis XVI and Necker had made a number of mistakes when it came to the calling of the Estates General itself. So the calling of the Estates General wasn't necessarily in and of itself a bad idea at the time at which that decision was made. But there were a couple of mistakes that were made in the process of calling the Estates General that would prove to be detrimental to the political settlement that was attempting to be achieved. So, for example, they left the decision of whether or not the votes would be counted by order or by head to be a discussion to be had at the first meeting. So rather than making that decision before the Estates General itself, they actually just let that be a decision to be made at the first meeting. This would be problematic for a number of different reasons, and I will talk about that in the next lesson. They had also made up no attempt to draw up any kind of proposals for consideration when the States General would eventually meet. So there wasn't really any kind of agenda for the meeting itself, again leading to a certain degree of political chaos and a certain degree of animosity between the different estates within the particular Estates General itself. They would be decisions that would, along with others, these decisions came with a number of other decisions also, such as the agreement that the third estate would have twice as many deputies as the other two. Again, a positive decision in this regard, but one that would become problematic as time goes on. And the voting would become the biggest issue. So that's why I've listed it first on this slide as the issues that were problematic for the Estates General, and we'll look at that in the next lesson. So what about the social state of France? How was French society operating during the May 1789 period of the Estates General? Well, from a social perspective, one of the major issues that had plagued French society was the position of the church. We remember that the clergy within French society is represented by the First Estate, contrary to what Crash Course says in their video. The First Estate is that of the clergy, the Second Estate is that of the nobility, and the Third Estate being the kind of some lower nobility and and essentially the rest of society in that regard. When we talk about the position of the church within French society, though, we have this idea that we have the fact that archbishops, bishops, and abbots would have the ability to collect a tax known as a tithe. Now, this issue was important because the issue here was that there was a corruption element which persisted in the fact that these members of the church kept most of the revenue from these collections. So corruption was a big problem initially when we're talking about the social state of France. It came to higher members of the clergy when there was a distinct impression that they would be incredibly wealthy as a result of their positions, something which was true. So the wealth that was generated by the sort of higher members of the clergy and the higher members of the positions within the church also led to this state of corruption, and this also perception of corruption. When it came to other areas of this of society, there was a distinct amount of resentment by some members of the nobility against court nobles, for example, on account of their relatively privileged positions and their very close connection to the king himself. So this is another social issue that was sort of represented in the Second Estate when it comes to French society. There was this problem between the general nobility, the nobility that did not have any kind of access to the king, and the other members of the nobility which did have access to the king. Again, something that was a central, essentially a melting pot for the growing of resentment that would begin to be established. The final thing I want to mention is, of course, arguably the most important and arguably the reason why we have all of these problems in the first place with Louis's finances, and this is the economic state of France by May of 1789. It was clear that there was a clear distinction in French society between rural and urban, so people working in agriculture and working in the countryside versus people working in towns and cities. In the 1700s, a huge increase in the growth of towns was the result of the fact that we see the development of new industries begin to develop. We see certain early signs of some industrialization going on, not to the same extent as what will eventually happen in the 1800s and into the 1900s, but there is an increase in the growth of towns due to the development of new industries. However, in the countryside, there were still issues relating to poor harvests, and this would have not only an economic impact of the state of France, but it would also have a social impact as well. So the problem of poor harvests can explain a number of different issues. Specifically, there were poor harvests in 1770 and 1789, i.e. 1789 when the Estates General meet. Moreover, the issue of landholding became a more prominent issue as we get into the 1790s. So what do we mean by landholding? Well, the policy of landholding was one where when a landowner died, the heirs to that particular land would split the land itself amongst them equally. So rather than all the land going towards one individual, we have this idea of it being divided amongst other individuals. And you can understand why this would be a problem when you have multiple heirs all inheriting smaller and smaller areas of land, the result of which was an ever division of agricultural land, which would then, as time goes on and it becomes more and more problematic as land gets more and more divided, would lead to an increase in the prominence of something known as subsistence farming, which is not a very effective or a very efficient way of being able to operate agricultural policy. And so when we have a further harvest of 1788, further harvest that leads to food prices increasing because of the poor harvest of 1788, which I've described here as a disaster, we see by the 14th of July of 1789, so a month after the initial calling of the Estates General, or 2 months after the initial calling of the Estates General, we see an increase in food prices. So general economics tells us that if there is a shorter amount of supply of a particular item, the price for that item becomes more increases. Essentially, it becomes more because that item is more sought after, and especially when you've got essential goods like agricultural produce, something that we need to eat to survive, especially in the 1700s, you have this growing problem. You have this issue of the fact that you have less and less yields in terms of crop yields, in terms of agricultural production, due to the fact that there are poor harvests, for example, in 1788. That leads to a lack of crop yields, an increase in the demand of crop yields, a lack of supply, therefore an increase in food prices. Food prices will peak on the 14th of July of 1789. Again, all of these tie into the broader problems and the broader personal finance problems that Louis XVI had, in terms of the fact that he was essentially going bankrupt and the crown was going bankrupt, and there needed to be this issuance of new taxation in order to try and fund or to keep essentially the crown afloat. All of these problems would snowball into the fact that we start to see the political disaster of the meeting of the Estates General in 1789, specifically in May of 1789.